Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 106. The topic is the Venn of BACs. I think an Eve Mailer-inspired title. Quick reminder, if you want to support the live stream, please follow the live stream on LinkedIn. That really helps us. Our guest today is David Brassard, CTO of Axiomatics, and returning Identirati from episode 4. Welcome, David.
Hi, happy to be back.
And I think we will have the pleasure of actually meeting again in person next week. Will you be at EIC in Berlin?
Yes, I will. I'm flying out this Friday, as a matter of fact. I'm going to spend a couple days at headquarters in Stockholm and then head down to Berlin. Yeah.
And you're speaking at EIC, right?
I am. I'm speaking along with Alex Olivier from Cerbos. We're talking about OpenID Auth-Zen, the latest in authorization standards.
I'm actually speaking with Alex at Identiverse.
Oh, cool.
What about? We have 20 minutes, right? The second to last session before you're like grabbing your plane on Friday for all those people who stay around for the closing plenary. We'll be right before that for 20 minutes talking about why embeddable PDPs are going to change the enterprise authorization landscape.
Sweet. I couldn't agree more. I think it's a very valid pattern.
Yeah. And what will you be talking about at EIC? You're going to be talking about token-based access control and why you love it so much?
I think it's a legitimate approach to authorization. EIC, we're going to focus simply on Auth-Zen and the work that we've been doing in the working group at OpenID in the past 6 months. We have a cadence of doing interops every major event. We're doing one at Identiverse. We're getting a working space at EIC so people can hash out their implementations, ask questions, so on and so forth. But the presentation itself is just going to be about the evolution of the APIs, how we're adding a search API and authorization. So a search API is an API through which, instead of asking a binary yes/no question, you can ask an open-ended question like, hey, tell me which records Alice can view, and then the search API is going to spit out the identifiers for you.
Right.
It'll be a short presentation as well. I think it's 20 minutes. It's on the Thursday. It'll be fun, right? It's I think it's my first time presenting with Alex, so it'll be good fun.
Yeah, I love what Cerbos is doing. I love their developer-centric orientation, the product, and I'm really a big fan of Cerbos. And I love their graphic designer. I think they have one of the best graphic designers because they wear their shirt all the time. So I'm like a walking Cerbos ad.
So for me, it's these guys. I don't know if we can see that, but that's my favorite
t-shirt. Yeah. I had one of those on yesterday, actually.
But full disclosure, my son, who's almost 2 years old, he'll be 2 in June. He sleeps with the enemy because Alex was kind enough to give me one of the Cerbos plushies, and it's now in his crib. So, yes, and of course, Cerbos is a competitor to Axiomatics. So, but yeah, I do love. Mike, sorry, just to wrap up what we said, I think, I've been doing this for the past 15 years, and if I look at Axiomatics and the competing landscape, in 2010s, 2015s, you had BitCoo, you had PlainID, you had Axiomatics, you had Oracle back in the day. A lot of the focus was on the business user in authorization, for better or for worse. And I think it's great to see Acerto, Cerbos also now focus on the developer, because it's forcing us to also adapt and serve the developer much better. And because the developer has a lot more power, it's important to talk to them and use their language, use their tooling. So absolutely.
Yeah, or permit.io.
Or permit.io, yep, totally.
They did actually a LinkedIn post about I think the 13 or 14 developer conferences they did. They have it down to a science, how to do the developer event. They wrote a great write-up for those of us who like this kind of stuff about how to run a perfect developer-focused event. It was great.
Yep.
And before we started, we're having a little back and forth about Auth-Zen, because I'm an Auth-Zen supporter. I voted for it or will vote for it at OpenID Foundation, Glue's a member. And I actually have made investment in Auth10. I am assigned my developers to implement it. It's the current version that's available is implemented in both the authorization server. So in auth server, we have an Auth10 endpoint. I actually proposed that a client use that today for the first time.
Cool.
And because it's not, we're not, I don't know, it was interesting, but we did have a use case. But more importantly, we've also built a sidecar that uses Auth10 as the JSON REST API that's running the Cedarling on the back end. So we have a Cedarling sidecar, and we use Auth10 as the interface for that. But at the same time, I'm maybe a bit of an Auth10 skeptic a little bit, because I feel like some of the utility of standards is setting not just sort of the how you make the requests, but what's in the value of those requests. So OpenID Connect wouldn't have been useful if it wasn't for the fact that we just find that there were different response types and different prompts. And so response type, token or code means that you want to do the code flow. And so what I see is Auth10 has defined response type, and they've defined prompt, but they haven't told you what those respective values are. And without the values, you actually can't get interoperability. So that's why I think it's a little bit overblown, the hype.
So I sort of agree with you, and I think we can learn from ZACML, as you know, one of the original authorization standards. Both ZACML and Auth10, they're general purpose standards. Of course, Auth10 just focuses on the request response, but if you want adoption, you're going to have to profile it. You're going to have to profile it for, say, ERP systems or CRM systems or finance systems. You're going to have to do what FAPI did for OpenID and open banking, right? So I totally agree with you. If we want this to be successful, we're going to have to define profiles that define the schemas. What payload are we looking for? Right now we say type and ID, maybe, and the type could be, user or JOT. It's very generic. Maybe in the future, we need to have something that resonates with the target system, a Salesforce or Workday. And then the responses right now, they just contain, in the most basic form, they just contain a Boolean that say true or false, access is denied or permitted. But there is this context element that you can return with a decision. And that context element can also be profiled to different verticals, to different use cases. If we do that, it's going to help with the adoption of Auth10 more than just the generic mechanism as it stands today. So yeah, I do agree with you. Absolutely. And that is, it's a lesson learned from ZACML, because ZACML had some timid attempts. There are a couple profiles for export control, for ITAR, for intellectual property protection, but it didn't really go any further. And I think we should have created, within the ZACML TC, when I was a member, we should have created both a request response profile for, say, a Salesforce, but also policies for a Salesforce, what it looks like to apply fine-grained authorization to a system.
Right. And just to state the obvious, like, had you not taken on the ZACML, you wouldn't have had the experience to then feed that into the design of Auth10. So, But I want to push back a little bit, though, on the comparison to FAPI, because with FAPI, OpenID says you can do, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And what FAPI said is, no, you can't. You can only do E and F. And so it wasn't that FAPI was defining the values. They were just saying, no, I'm sorry, you can't do implicit flow. That's not going to be acceptable. So I think it's not 100% good analogy.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
Mr. Button. I tell you, something new happens every time on the live stream. So,
and now live from Mike's house, an identity striptease.
No, we're going the other direction, though. Thank goodness for the audience.
Yeah.
So okay, and then my other feeling was that the industries themselves are actually doing that profiling. Like, as soon as we got into the moment I decided I couldn't work on Auth10 anymore was when we started talking about the HTTP profile, which is something you think we should be able to agree on. And it became immediately obvious that there was no way we were going to agree on what that profile looked like. And then I started questioning, are we even the right people to be doing that? really you want the business people. And so I don't know. So you're saying, well, let's create this infrastructure so we can use this infrastructure to create these quote unquote profiles. And I'm not even sure that we should be the one creating those profiles. And then, or that we're giving them any prescriptive information about what goes in those profiles.
So different things. First of all, the number one goal of AuthZen was really to provide a standardized interface so that you can externalize authorization and query a PDP. And I mean PDP in the broad sense. I don't want to say PDP that's policy configured. I'm thinking of Alex from IndyKite. He does not want to use policies. He does not know what's good for him. So I mean PDP in the broad sense, right? So the point was to really standardize that, because as it turns out, Zachwell already had a standard interface, but Open Policy Agent really didn't. Open Policy Agent let you express whatever JSON response you wanted to. It's extremely flexible, but it was 95% the same as Zachwell. And then you took a Cerbos to have their own way of doing it, a Signal to have their own way of doing it. You take an OSO to have their own way of doing it. So just standardizing that was already a key victory, because it meant that a customer or a product could say, integrate with OSO and then switch to Cerbos, then switch to Axiomatics, then switch to
that's totally wait. Let me push back on you right there and just say that's kind of seems like a wishful thinking to me, because let's think just about the API gateway standard part of it. So okay, I'm an API gateway vendor. I don't want to do one-offs with OSO or OPA or Axiomatics. I just want to be able to write one standard. Now, because each of those PDPs has different ways that you send the resource, principal, action, and context, you still need to send a different request to each vendor. So I'm still doing a one-off to each vendor. So I don't really have interoperability.
No, you don't. No, you don't. That's not true, because in so a few different things. And this is true, by the way, of Zachwell. It's also true of AuthZen. It's even truer of AuthZen. So in AuthZen, we decided to standardize both ID and type for subject and resource, and standardized name for action, and then context is free form, right? So what it means is that an API gateway, when they're going to be sending a request to an Axiomatics, it would be the same way if they sent it to Nacerto. Actually, case in point, a year ago, I approached Zuplo. Zuplo are a SaaS API gateway. They're a pretty cool API gateway. And I said, hey, Zuplo, you should totally integrate with Axiomatics because you do APIs, we do authorization, match in heaven. And they said, sure, we'll do it. And so they spoke Zachwell JSON to Axiomatics. And then a few months later, Acerto, unbeknownst to me, goes to Zuplo and says, hey, Zuplo, you should integrate with Acerto. So Zuplo says, yeah, sure, we'll do it. And they ended up with two different integrations, one that spoke whatever Acerto takes in, a JSON payload, and one that spoke Zachwell JSON, right? And then this past March, Zuplo joined the AuthZen bandwagon and they adopted AuthZen. What did that do? It effectively killed the Acerto Zuplo and the Axiomatic Zuplo integrations, because they didn't need it anymore. They could just use AuthZen to talk to either of Axiomatics or Acerto or Cerbos or another vendor interchangeably, because we all use the same ID and type structure. Now, it doesn't mean that we also need a technical profile, right? I want to distinguish, there's two different profiles, Mike, that you need. You need the technical profile. So the API gateway profile that Ami started in the working group is essentially a profile that says, well, there's an HTTP method or a verb in HTTP. How do we map that to an attribute in AuthZen? Or there's a bunch of headers in an HTTP request. How do we convert those into an AuthZen request? Where do they go? So that's where the profiling comes in, because the base request doesn't contain the notion of headers, right? And by the way, that HTTP gateway profile, it would actually be worth writing it, or it would have been worth writing it for Zachwell way back when. I don't think anyone ever did, but it would have been helpful to say, hey, this is how you're going to be handling headers. This is how you're going to be handling path, context, route, all these different things that exist in API gateway land that we could communicate back to a PDP. So there is value in creating that technical profile. That being said, technical profile alone is not enough, because technical profile says this is how you talk from a technical product in API gateway to a PDP. Then you need business profile, which is, oh, I'm dealing with a pharmaceutical database or clinical trials, or I'm dealing with a content management system or a CRM. And these are the types of objects that I'm dealing with. And, oh, there's a relationship between account and customer representative or account executive, right? These are These are the business profiles that you want to define so that you end up with meaningful business authorization requests.
Okay.
Sorry, that was very, very long-winded.
I'm going to go a little more specific here.
Yeah.
This request that we're sending in AuthZen, it has 4 components: subject, action, resource, context. Right?
Correct.
We agree on that?
Yep.
Okay. Let's just talk about the subject. So the subject is basically, it's a key in a JSON, so you can send anything. There's a value called subject, and then you can send a JSON object as the subject, correct?
So there's a type and an ID that's mandatory. The type value could be anything, and the ID could be anything. Right? The type could be user, jot, anything you like. This is what needs to be profiled to make it more relevant to the different applications you're dealing with. But type and ID are mandatory.
Okay. What should the value of the ID be?
That needs to be profiled. Right now, in the interops that we're doing, the one that we're doing for the search API
and
for
what
Identiverse,
types are supported?
I'm sorry?
And what types are supported?
Right now, type is free form. So it could be the literal value jot, which we used for a demo. It could be user, which is what I'm using in the search API demo.
So the only way you get interoperability is if Asserto and Axiomatics happen to be following all of the same conventions. That's the only way you get interoperability.
And that is the point of the API gateway profile when it comes out. That is the point of the business profiles, absolutely. But we all agree that type and ID exist and that we can look at it.
Yeah. So, like I said, I'm not off the AuthZen bandwagon. I think it is useful standardizing that interface. I didn't want to invent another way to send those 4 pieces of information.
Yeah.
But all of the work is in the profiling, and none of the work is in the sending.
It's both. It's both. You still have.
Well, let me just say, the sending part of it, it took us 3 days to knock out that.
Because it's simple.
So there was very little work in saying, okay, I have a JSON with 4 keys, and I'm going to map it to something. So that was trivial.
But so to me, the magic in AuthZen was that you had pre-existing products that did their own thing. Most of them were JSON based, but I guess they don't have to be. Some folks like gRPC and like other protocols. But the point was that if you used an OPA based PDP, your request would have been a JSON document, an unstructured JSON document. I'm going to say, I know it sounds a bit weird, but meaning that the structure of the JSON document was only understandable by the OPA service. In Xactwell land, there's actually a specific structure that you have to follow, but they're still very generic, right? And so AuthZen said, you know what, let's learn from those. So we did a prior art study. We looked at OPA, of course. We looked at Cedar, which didn't really have an API to speak of. We looked at Xactwell. We looked at Serbo, Signal, Asserto, and we kind of did the common denominator between these different approaches, and that's how we ended up with the structure that we have. It is not enough because it's missing the technical profiles for API gateways and other products or IDPs, and it is not enough because it's missing the business profiles. Absolutely, yeah.
I like the idea. Like I said, I like the idea of the interface. Not convinced how much it helps me. In a way, if it took us 3 days to implement, how hard could this thing really be? Like, it took us years to do multiple layers of optional. OpenID has mandatory and may have, must haves. It took us years to go through and actually implement all the things that they specified. If it took us 3 days, how hard could this thing act? What is really there?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the request response, how you ask a question, with how you implement the decision logic, right? The hard part, take Xactwell as an example, the hard part in Xactwell is not the request response. It's actually the processing, the language, whatever. Same thing with OPA, by the way. The hard part was Rego, the language, not so much the request response. How hard is it to express in a format a yes/no question? Hey, can Alice view document 1? There aren't really, 2 different ways of formulating this. And how hard is it to reply permit deny if you're going to be speaking ZACWL, or true false if you're going to be speaking auth-zen, or allowed if you're speaking OPA or whatever your OPA engine uses, right? So that's what auth-zen represents. It's definitely the easy part, but it's also the part that gives interoperability and compatibility across a broader range, of products, for sure.
For just the request, as long as you don't care about what the heck goes in there.
Well, we acknowledge, like, I'm
it's a starting point. Yeah.
I'm very biased towards a policy-based model, right? Obviously. And there's a bunch of, there's 15 different PDPs that have taken part in the auth-zen work so far. Probably 2/3 or 3/4 of those PDPs are also policy-based. CEDAR is an example, Cerbos is an example. We're all biased that way. But of course, there's always Indicite and Alex and Omri, who are graph biased, and OpenFGA as well, right? My point was that I don't want to inflict on the customer whether we think graph or policy. Let the customer choose their model. It's okay, because auth-zen gives you that, it shields you from the specific of the underlying implementation.
Right. And maybe that's a good way to pivot into the official topic of the conversation, which is token-based access control.
Yeah.
You had an interesting take on CEDAR. Can I put you on the spot and ask you?
You can put me on the spot.
Why don't you like CEDAR? Why don't you? Well, let me be more specific and say CEDAR spent a long time studying. The CEDAR science team spent a long time studying policies and defining a policy syntax that they felt was performant, that they felt was or had ergonomic syntax, and that was what they felt provably deterministic, and they defined the CEDAR syntax. Why do you have problem with? I was surprised. I assume there'll be more syntaxes in the future. What do you have against somebody writing a new syntax?
Well, I'm going to point you to XKCD, and in particular, cartoon number 927. I just looked it up. I didn't remember the number. Obviously, that would be a bit freaky. In that cartoon, and I love what Rendell. I'm sorry.
927.
927. Yeah. In that cartoon, Rendell Munro, who's the illustrator behind XKCD, talks about competing standards. Right. So there's two little stick figures saying, "Oh my God, there's 14 standards. Let's create a standard that unifies all 14 standards." And then, soon there are 15 competing standards. So my beef with CEDAR is it's kind of twofold. Number one, they're creating a new standard, which is unfortunate. I kind of had the same beef with ReGo when it came out, but ReGo served a slightly different purpose. So it made sense for ReGo to exist as well. And then, of course, there's always a part of me that dies when I see this happen, because I'm like, oh my God, there was ZACWL before and there was Alpha next, and the model behind Alpha or ZACWL, it works perfectly fine. The P*P model works perfectly fine. A part of me died when I saw NIST create NGAC. I was like, why do you need to create NGAC when there's already something that exists? But NGAC at least was graph-based, so it was a different approach to everything. But the point with CEDAR is, when I talked to Julian back at Identiverse 2023, I asked, why did you invent CEDAR? And he goes, well, because Open Policy Agent is an open-ended language, and you can do everything and anything you want to. So it's really hard to, it's hard to edit, audit, test, so on and so forth. So we created CEDAR, which gives you a more formal approach and verifiable policies. And I go, well, why didn't you look at Alpha? Because Alpha is pretty much like CEDAR, except that it has a structure as well. And he goes, I did not know that existed. And so part of me goes, well, that's a mistake on the Oasis's part to not have advertised Alpha more. It's a mistake on my part, for sure, to not have advertised Alpha more. But it's also, if you're going to do prior art, do proper prior art. Like, look at all the standards that exist. And yeah, it's a little unfortunate, because
so
now
your main beef with it is it's because they invented it for no reason, and it doesn't have any novel features that that Alpha didn't have.
I think they have one interesting feature that Alpha doesn't have, or that is sort of outside of the scope of Alpha, and that's the schema. In CEDAR, when you define attributes, you actually define a schema of attributes. Open Policy Agent has that as well, of course, because they work on JSON documents. That's something that Alpha sort of ignores, because it just wants to have attributes, but where you define them, what they represent, what the structure is kind of irrelevant to alpha or ZACL. So that's the cool thing. But apart from that,
that's pretty major, because with the schema, that it enables you to do static analysis and prove that you can't make a query that can't be answered by a policy.
Yeah, you can do that in ZACL too without the schema.
But you actually said that schema is one of the areas where it's really important for profiling, right?
So it is, yeah, absolutely. And so,
what is your suggestion for how we should define, for how these ecosystems should define the schema?
Well, if you look at ZACL as an example, if you look at FIRE and HL7, they actually went in their own terms, in their own corner, they went and profiled ZACL for their own use cases without telling the ZACL technical committee. I came across them by pure chance, right? So they actually defined what a healthcare policy should look like and what the attributes should look like. Same, the group that worked, I can't remember, it's one of the intelligence agencies that worked on profiling SAML for their purposes. I can't remember if it was FBI or one of them, doesn't matter. They did the same work for ZACL, like defining what policies should look like if you wanted to.
I think schema is sort of like whether, I don't know if OPA defines schema or not, or let's just take XYZ PDP. I would always think that you could have like a tool that would basically render the schema in different PDPs. So I don't see the schema itself. I think what's interesting, to get circling back to CEDAR though, I think what's interesting about CEDAR, I think your observation is correct, that that by being more restrictive and formalized about how the schema is declared, it leads to more bounds on terms of what the policies might do, which I think ultimately leads towards less permutations you need to do in static analysis to prove that your engine is safe.
Absolutely. So creating a schema it's leading to more work up front, but it's also leading to easier to understand policies, easier to analyze policies, easier to test policies down the road. Absolutely. And that's what, like, we don't use CEDAR, of course, we use Alpha, but we teach our customers to create schemas, data schemas, so that when they reason on their policies later, they can actually say, oh, the policy is complete or it's not complete.
David, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my point is that we didn't really need to invent CEDAR. There were plenty other languages out there, but there's other vendors that have invented their own JSON schemas for policies as well. And
Cerbos,
like OSO and Polar, so OSO and Polar is Cerbos, and I don't know what their JSON language is called, but they have their own JSON language. Signal is the same way. But there's another point actually, Mike, which might sound weird coming from me, but to some degree, is there value in standardizing the policy language? Like in my 15 years of doing ZACL, I've only ever had maybe 3-4 cases where I literally had to exchange policies with another PDP that happened not to be an Axiomatics PDP, right? So it's not that often. The request response is fundamental. So the auth-then work is fundamental. The policy standardization, it's interesting because it gives you the assurance the policy language is as strong, as secure, as analyzable, to CEDAR's point. But it's not about interoperability. It's more about the quality of the language.
Yeah. I have a different view of this a little bit, because I see PDPs as like databases. And how many different databases and different ways, query languages and persistence mechanisms and in-memory versus on the desk versus cloud. Like every time you turn around, there's a new database, right? And my feeling is PDPs are the same thing, that we're going to have, there are databases that are optimized for time series, like Timescale DB, where they're really optimized for making time series queries. And so my theory is that PDPs are like databases, and depending upon the use case that you're facing and the architecture that you have, then you might choose one PDP over another. And so I see that we're going to see more and more PDPs and more syntaxes and more ways to solve this problem, and nothing that we can do can stop that. And I think my perspective is more as curator of how can we curate some of this and make it usable by enterprises. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Do you think
But
that we're going to stop seeing any?
no, I think it's human nature to want to create new standards. I mean, there would not be an XKCD about it if it wasn't true, right? So you're probably very much right, which then begs the question: will there be a policy orchestration layer ever? And of course, Mike, you know this. Jerry Gable and Phil Hunt of Strata have been working on a project called IDQL, which I think stands for Identity Definition Query Language, if I'm not mistaken. And IDQL is kind of meant to be the meta language of all languages that you could use to define your use cases and then provision into Open Policy Agent, Zackwell Alpha, maybe Cerbos, Oso Polar one day, so on and so forth, right? So maybe policy orchestration is the next frontier.
I need to ask Jerry to also, he was on the original episode 4 with you. He's also a veteran and Identerati. Yeah, I need to get him back on and to talk just about that topic. I want to actually finally steer to our actual topic today, which is token-based access control. So here's my take on it. Okay, obviously role-based access control only addresses a small number of our use cases. It doesn't, just to talk about some of the things that it doesn't do, it doesn't help us with non-human identities. It doesn't help us with delegation very well. Like, how do I delegate authority to an AI agent to maybe book a ticket for me? There's a lot of challenges that are being faced by customers. There's a lot of end user confusion about multi-factor authentication. Stepped up authentication is basically an authorization policy. It's like, I can't trust, I need to get better assurance about this user, but they've already authenticated. So by nature, it's almost an auth Z. We have issuing a lot more tokens than in the past. We're issuing not only authentication tokens, but also attestations about authentication. What type of passkey was it? Does it have was it a shared passkey or was it a device-bound passkey? What about transaction tokens? You mentioned Signal. They're behind a new draft for issuing a new type of OAuth token with specific granular details called transaction tokens. Basically, there's all of these challenges right now. And what's clear to me is that our existing solutions aren't really solving them, and that we needed something different, some different framework. And then, so I know people say attribute-based or policy-based. So let me take those in order. Policy-based, I see as sort of a meta framework, like you're almost like an orchestration framework, like you're talking about. Like I have PAM systems, privileged access management. I have axiomatics here in this corner. I have some graph stuff over here. I have some RBAC stuff over here. I need one overarching sort of like policy governance structure. I think that's how Plain ID sort of looks at it. And I see that as a very useful tool to give operational leverage to enterprise managers. But I don't see it as actionable. Like I'm a developer and somebody says do policy-based access control. That's kind of like, here's this oxygen-based air. Like you didn't really tell me what to do. And then ABAC, I feel like there's a pretty broad range of implementations of what ABAC means. RBAC's actually, I think, an ANSI standard. And so it's very well defined. It's just incredibly inflexible. But ABAC is sort of like the opposite, where it's very flexible, but it's not very well defined. And so I'm actually, was starting to figure out how do we talk to developers and explain to them a way where we could say, here's how you're going to do security now. We used to send you roles, and you would take those roles and you'd have some brittle mapping to capabilities in your application. We're going to take that off your plate because we're going to now give you a policy engine. And we're going to say to you, okay, you're going to need to, you know what action you're doing on what resource, it's your app. And instead of telling us who that person is, provide as evidence this bundle of tokens that you've acquired, either because you're a back-end app or because you've authenticated a user and obtained tokens.
Yeah.
And then we'll be able to, with that bundle of tokens, we'll be able to pick apart what those tokens mean, validate the tokens, map them to entities, and then evaluate should we grant you access to that resource. But from a developer perspective, it's an easy message. Use this policy engine, get the policies here, and submit your tokens as input to policy. End of story. So that was the reason I thought of it, and the feedback has been good. But I expected everyone to say, yeah, the last thing we need is another access control mechanism. And so I was sort of happy when you stuck up your hand and said, yeah, maybe we don't need another access control mechanism.
I think my only beef with it is maybe the name, right? I'm a little wary of creating another StarBAC acronym, although it makes for great Venn diagrams, and we need Eve on this podcast so she can help us draw out those Venns. But I agree with a lot of the things you said on the PBAC v ABAC piece.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues wrote a really nice sentence yesterday. We're about to actually publish an article on PBAC, ABAC, TBAC, RBAC, BAC, just to kind of clarify the muddied waters. But she said essentially ABAC and PBAC are essentially the same thing. I agree. But ABAC, you look at it from the lens of the attribute from that dimension, and PBAC, you look at it from the lens of the policy, right? But policies use attributes. Attributes on their own are worthless. They need to be activated or used in a policy to make sense, right? There's other subtle differences you could think of, right? You could have an ABAC system that essentially says if a user has these attributes, give them that role. So then it becomes like a provisioning policy, not so much a runtime authorization ABAC mechanism. I do want to go back also on something you said, Mike. You said that RBAC is really well defined. It's an NC standard. True. And it was a NIST standard before that, right? 1982, the NIST paper on RBAC. And ABAC is also very well defined. It's a NIST standard, 2013. The folks, David Fariolo, Vincent Hugh, who took part in RBAC in 92, published the ABAC paper in 2013, like I said, and they also created NGAC as a reference implementation of what ABAC should be, right? And what's interesting with NGAC is it's not really a policy-based language, it's a graph-based model, so it's kind of a cool way to do ABAC. PBAC, however, like it's more of a marketing term.
But there are other ABAC implementations out there, right?
That do not need to use policy, by the way. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. PBAC to me is more of a marketing term. And yesterday, as I was working on that article I just mentioned, I went to Google Trends and I looked up PBAC and ABAC and another term I can't remember. RBAC probably. So RBAC, of course, blows everyone. Actually, no, sorry. ABAC was the most common term. RBAC was second. PBAC was nearly non-existent. And the results for PBAC were actually some pharmaceutical term, not the policy-based access control term.
Yeah.
So it kind of shows that PBAC is it's unfortunate that it's there. It's also unfortunate that ABAC was called ABAC, perhaps because the feature that sticks out in ABAC, it really is the policy. But I think it was called ABAC by opposition to roles and groups. It's not just about roles and groups. It's about multiple attributes of the user and the resource and the action, right? But all this to say that to me, TBAC is not defined in opposition to ABAC or PBAC. To me, TBAC is another plane altogether. TBAC is very much what you said, right? It's about conveying tokens, identity information, metadata about the user. It's about enabling the delegation use case. You know, a lot of people ask me, and I see Rohit here ask, you know, how does AI or AI agents impact StarBAC, right? And people have been asking me, you know, can you tackle fine-grained authorization for agentic AI? And my answer is, yeah. We don't need, like, if you take a policy-based approach, and I'm sure you'll get the same answer from the likes of my peers in the Auth group, right? As long as we know the identity of the end user and the identity of the agent, so I know that it's, you know, agent travel, blah, 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 booking a flight on behalf of Mike Schwartz, then we can write a policy that uses both of these pieces of metadata to determine whether the travel agent can book a trip on your behalf, Mike. And that's where TBAC comes in, because you actually want to convey that information all the way down to the PDP, and the PDP needs to trust that token, needs to know what's inside. So to me, TBAC complements ABAC and PBAC, if you want to call it that, right? They're not antagonistic at all. And we do need richer tokens, and we do need the on behalf of metadata if we want to start doing delegation use cases or agent use cases.
Yeah, and so I see all of these access control mechanisms existing in parallel, and perhaps overlapping, like you say. One thing that I want to say about the policy base or attribute base, it's like, yes, you can make a policy about everything, and everything can have attributes. Like the whether the signature is valid, maybe that could be expressed as an attribute, right? But in a way, what TBAC offers that perhaps over ABAC is that it talks about the provenance of the claim and not just about the claim itself.
Yep, absolutely.
And in the Seederling, we actually have two authorized interfaces. We have one that's called authorized unsigned, where the application just asserts identity. This is user foo, and I've authenticated this user with LDAP, or perhaps I even authenticated them and have an ID token. But I'm not going to show you that ID token, but trust me, I authenticated this guy. Yep. And then you just straight out assert your subject, right?
Yep.
We have another interface called authorize, just called authorize, period. And that's where you send your tokens. And so one of the tricky things about security, I think, is that it's not only the policies, but also the trust model that needs to be conveyed. And that the cognitive load on developers to understand that trust model is really high. Yes, the developers could make, yes, we could make policies, but we really want to get the developers out of the business of having to have a PhD in JWT tokens to be able to break apart and validate these so that they can even send input to the policies, the well-defined attribute policies. So part of what I'm advocating for is to just make this easy to say, okay, developers, you conflate all these tokens. You don't know the difference between an ID token and an access token, and that's fine. Just give us your tokens. We're going to let the CISO decide whether he wants to use the access token as the user principal or the ID token, right? So just give us the tokens. We can define how we validate those tokens, which includes not just signature validation, but also content validation. What are the proper claims for a transaction token? No developer should have to know that. So, and then finally, status revocation. We need to check that this token is not only validly signed. It might be a 1-minute token, but it might have been revoked 30 seconds ago. So there's a way now to revoke. So we need to take all of this cognitive load about understanding the different types of tokens and the trust models and the mapping behind each of those tokens, and just say, forget it, developers, give us your tokens, use this policy engine, and we'll give you an answer. And right now, policy-based access control and attribute-based access control are so generic that as a developer, I don't know what to do with that.
Well, also as a developer, all of this is hidden away from you, right? Because it's in the PDP and the engine, and you're not exposed. Thankfully, you're not exposed to all that logic. So what's cool about
you are though, because you have to actually pull apart, validate that token, and start pulling the claims out of it and sending it to your PDP.
Oh no, you don't. You can. That depends on your architecture, but you can absolutely send an entire token, an opaque token, to the PDP, and let the PDP do the chewing for you.
So you're on my side. You also think we should use token-based access control.
Well, for me, a token is just another attribute. What's cool though is that having a token, like if it's just an attribute in the simplest sense,
it is not an attribute. It is a signed JSON from an issuer that you trust that contains a JSON payload that contains multiple claims.
So in other words, in my language, it's a way more trustworthy attribute that you can actually verify the provenance, you can verify the signature. So there's a lot more things you can do. But bear in mind,
it's not an attribute, David. It's an attestation or an assertion.
Which, from a ZACL standpoint, is still an attribute.
It contains attributes. It's not an attribute.
It's a bag of from a ZACL. It's a bag of attributes.
If you can get to bag of attributes, I could agree with you. I can agree with you that it's an attribute. But the attribute is it's a token, but then we're at a very high level. because it's a blob. A bag of attributes I can maybe get on board with.
Yeah, I mean, to us, having tokens now just provides richer information to work with. And so better quality policies and better quality decision making. I think that's the bottom line. In Zachbool, there was actually a feature called issuer on attributes that you could use to discriminate between, if someone said your role as manager or your role as contractor, you could have said, oh, well, if it's the corporate LDAP saying this, I'm going to trust it more than if it's, a database saying this. Mm-hmm. So you could actually play with the value of issuer, but having tokens is even better because now you have let's call it a structured attribute or a bag of attribute, if you like, of attributes that, like you say, convey the provenance, convey their trustworthiness, convey their validity, if they've been revoked or not revoked. So absolutely. And also, Mike, tokens, they give you a means to convey, going back to Rohit's question about AI agents, it gives you a means to convey end user identity, system identity, agent identity, because these are use cases we're going to see more and more on behalf of or the delegation models.
Right. Yeah. Rohit jumps right to the most difficult question.
Yeah.
But okay, well, if you want to hear more of this, I think you're going to have to come to EIC. And we can take it up over refreshments. Hopefully the weather will cooperate and we can go outside too.
Well, May in Berlin is usually nice. Let's not jinx it.
Yeah.
But yeah, Mike, I think like the bottom line is,
I was going to give you last thoughts. You want to do your last thoughts?
Yeah. Well, so my last thought is TBAC. I mean, apart from the name that, I kind of hate reinventing new names all the time, but sure, TBAC. It's very complementary to ABAC, PBAC, so on and so forth. What I want to take away is that you really want to have, on the one hand, the layer that deals with the identity establishment, the trustworthiness of your information, be it attributes, be it tokens, be it whatever, right? You really want to have that under control, and you want to be able to convey and trickle identity down to wherever you want to use it. That's why transaction tokens are so cool. That's why your TBAC model is so cool, because it's a way to transfer that identity down to the right layers. That's one dimension, right? The x-axis or the y-axis, right? The other axis is the authorization models that consume that information, right? So whether it's a policy-based model or a graph-based model or whatever, they all use multiple sources of data, so multiple sources of attributes, and they can make decisions based on that information. The better quality the attribute, the better quality the decision, the better quality the input token, the better quality the decision making, right? But the authorization models that exist out there, be it policy based or graph based or a hybrid model like Topaz, they all allow for these new use cases that we're seeing in the agent AI use case. It doesn't have to be AI, by the way, just the agent use case was enough for the delegation to be used. Or you mentioned NHIs as well, right? Workload identity, non-human identities as a whole. The authorization models as we know them today, they're very well suited to tackle those use cases. It all depends on the source attributes. And TBAC is going to be a great way to get us there.
Okay. So let me just quickly announce the next episode. We're going to talk about intelligent vehicle experience. So maybe we'll get to Rohit's question because, cars are getting smarter. And here's our non-human identity example. And this will be after this is this coming Thursday, this conversation. So I'm actually looking forward to this one because it's a good practical, David, our talk was a very sort of kind of at a high level. This one I think will be interesting. We'll drill down on vehicles, and those of us who drive, especially in the U.S., know how terrifying intelligent vehicle experience can be. All right, that was great, David. We didn't cover it all. I certainly wanted to respond to the things you said, but I agree with mostly what you said. But if you find me at EIC, if you're there, ask me what else I would have said if we had more time.
Yeah.
Anything else, David? I'm willing to give you more time.
I think, Mike, we could do a live feed outside the convention center in Berlin, with my phone and like we're some cool teenagers doing Twitch or something.
I tried it once at EIC. Christina Yasuda did a presentation which I wanted to share with people on OpenID for VC at the time, and I don't think I have the technical chops to pull it off.
All right,
So
let's see
that
if you
was
and I
my
can pull it off
conclusion.
next week.
Um,
We'll see.
but there's, so this is episode 106. I'm in it for at least another 100 episodes or so. So there's plenty of more opportunities for us to come when we're not so rushed at a conference and discuss
Yeah.
this stuff with a wider audience. But I don't know if you're up for it, David. We'll see if we could pull it off.
Yeah, let's try to do something.
Okay.
I got some breaking news for you next week. So.
All right. Thank you so much, David, for joining us.
My pleasure. Bye.